When you're soldering, one of the first things you need to do is tin your wires or your surfaces that you're going to solder together. You don't want to just stick them together and then stick solder on it and expect it to work out. What you want to do is get the wire hot, and you want the solder to melt onto the wire. You don't want to just get the solder, melt the solder and then stick it on there. You want your wire to be hot, and you'll see it kind of melt in and wick. The wire will actually absorb the solder, and that's a really good tinned wire there. Once your wires are tinned very well, you can turn them and make sure that they're tinned all the way around. Then it's pretty simple. Just try not to move it as you go ahead and get them hot, and then try to be as still as possible while it cools. It only takes a few seconds, but if you move it while it's trying to cool, you can get what's called a cold solder joint, which isn't what you want. So try to hold it really still. When you're soldering little bitty components like this little microphone or a transistor, you might not want to have your iron as hot as possible, and you might want to try to make it quick, because if you get these really hot, you might damage them. So be careful with that. So here's my iron. Just be sure to use the little sponge, get it a little wet before you start. That way when your iron starts getting junk on it, you go ahead and just clean it real quick, get a little bit of fresh solder on there, and you're ready to start working. And if junk starts building up, see some bubbles there, just... So one thing to note is whenever you're soldering, you get extra solder on your tip, you'll want to go ahead and shake that extra solder off. But usually when it hits the table, it'll dry. This has a pretty big glob. It's still a little wet, but it'll dry, and you can just pick it off, and usually doesn't hurt your countertops. Notice that I have this little fan here. It's not really good to breathe as much smoke as possible, so I made this little whisper quiet fan. It's just a quiet PC fan, but I wanted something really quiet but would still make a little bit of a breeze, get the smoke out of your face so you aren't just breathing it. So when appropriate, it's good to have I think it's called a helping hand, to help hold the things you're working on, because you don't only have so many hands. Here I'm going to go ahead and prepare the surfaces by tinning them really good with some fresh solder. And you can tell my iron is definitely hot enough to get the solder on there, and if your iron isn't hot enough, you might have trouble getting the solder to tin on there right. So the temperature, having a good temperature on your iron is important. Trim them up a little bit. Apply the two surfaces here. When you're troubleshooting a board and maybe there's intermittent issues going on, you might check people's solder job and see and make sure that the solder's holding. I found one here. It's a good example of a cold solder joint. It's actually, there's something here that could wiggle, but not always just stuff that wiggles, and you can see that there's a break in the solder. A lot of times they're really hard to spot, but you'll notice that even when it's down close, there's like a little ring around it. There's like a little line that once you see a few of them, you'll be able to detect them and know that you need to just slap some new solder on there and fix it up. Alright, I'm going to really show you what happens when you're not hot enough. Here my iron is hot enough to melt the solder, but you can see I'm having trouble getting it on there. It's because the iron isn't heating up the metal. You want to heat up the metal and then apply the solder to the metal. So look, that didn't even stick. It's just not hot enough. My iron isn't big enough. Alright, so now I've cranked my iron up to about 800 degrees to see what happens. First thing you want to do is get a little solder on your iron so it can make contact with your wire. Then you want to get your wire hot enough, and then you can actually put the solder not directly on the iron, but probably down on the wire. This thing is so huge that I probably shouldn't be doing it with this small of an iron. But there, it's starting to get warm. You can see the solder is actually starting to stick. It's not going to just fall off.